Well, hello again. This is Robert here, and talking about some more of my classic country collection. What I was going to share with you today is some of the Columbia Harmony LPs. Now, Columbia in the mid 50s, as they released their country, they released current issues on going into the 50s and 60s. But when you wanted to look for some of those country artists' original recordings that they'd made back in the 30s, 40s, or 50s, you had to go to Columbia's subsidiary label, Harmony. Now, Harmony released a lot of nice LPs through the late 50s and on into the 60s. And it was many ways, it was the only way you could get these artists' original recordings. They had a lot of nice releases. They were good sound quality. The songs generally were just 10 songs on their compilations, but it was a good way to get a lot of the good early country music of the good classic. Now, I'm going to start out with the Carter Family releases on the Harmony label. I got one album of them now playing on the turntable. But I'll share with you one of the one of their very early releases, which was popular at the time. The Carter Family recorded for Columbia in 1935, again in 1940. This album here was right popular as a release. It was the famous Carter Family. It featured Wildwood Flower, Keep on the Sunny Side, Lula Walls, and My Clinch Mountain Home. Now, they had recorded those songs earlier for Victor. In some cases, the recuts were actually not quite as good as the original. Some cases, they were a little better. And also, the many original songs appeared on Columbia, especially Can the Circle Be Unbroken? And that is also on this album as well. Another one of their Harmony releases was the country sounds of the original Carter Family, Will You Miss Me When I'm Gone, Cannonball Blues. They were remakes of their earlier recordings. But also, I'm Thinking Tonight of My Blue Eyes, and Black Jack David, which was from 1940, was featured on here. Another one was the great original recordings of the Carter Family. Again, Kissing is a Crime, Sea of Galilee, Bear Creek Blues, and a number of others. And the one that's playing now was Home Among the Hills, which featured, of course, that song, Saturday Lonesome Day, nice bluesy number there by them, Little Poplar Log House on the Hill, and others. So some very nice ways to get some of the original Carter Family. The only way for years until more modern CD era has been able to release all the recordings. Bill Monroe. This was one from the early 60s of Bill Monroe's best. It featured True Life Blues, Summertime Is Past and Gone, Heavy Traffic Ahead. So there were some of them when he had Flatt and Scruggs, a few from his 1945 sessions, but a very nice release nonetheless. Then the original Bluegrass Sound largely feature recordings that he made with Flatt and Scruggs in his band. Most of the songs are from that era. And then finally, the great Bill Monroe was his third Harmony release that featured the original Blue Moon in Kentucky, featured a couple of the songs in 1949 that Mac Wiseman had sang lead with him on. Very nice one of Gene Autry from the cover is nice, but it's for late 30s and early 40s recordings. Of course, You Are My Sunshine, Blueberry Hill, Tweedle Twill, and a number of others on this album. Little Jimmy Dickens had a couple releases on the Harmony label. This one here featured the Galvanized Washing Tub, Bessie the Heifer, Walk Chicken Walk, other novelty type numbers. And then also was Little Jimmy Dickens' best, which had Hillbilly Fever was notable in there. I Got a Hole in My Pocket, which was notable among rockabilly collectors for that 1958 recording. For a long time, it was the only way you could get any early George Morgan was on this album, A Room Full of Roses, which features that hit. Beautiful recording of Please Don't Let Me Love You, which was a flip side of his hit Candy Kisses, and a number of others. But it was a nice album of his early 50s recordings. Then we have Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was big in the early 60s. It had been recording since 1957. And this features the very original, the first version of Don't Be Angry, which was his first recording he made in 1957. That on here, as well as a number of others from the late 50s era, even into the early 60s, is on this album. And there was a few nice releases of Lefty Frizzell. One of the first Harmony releases was Sings the Songs of Jimmy Rogers. And that's always been a popular listen for him. Also came Country Favorites, which featured a number of his early 50s hits. And then finally, the Mom and Dad's Waltz album. Interestingly, the Mom and Dad's Waltz on this is a remake, but you have a number of early and mid-50s releases on here. One of the first Flatt and Scruggs, or the first Flatt and Scruggs harmony release, was this album right here. Nice picture of them, which featured early and mid-50s recordings, Earl's Breakdown, Foggy Mountain Special, Don't Let Your Deal Go Down, and others. Just a Class A album all the way around. And then came this one, a couple years later, Great Original Recordings Volume 1. This features mostly early 50s, their 50 to 54 recordings, before Buck Graves joined them with the Dobro. It's called Volume 1. There never was a Volume 2. And a nice album of songs to cherish. This album you'll see on the eBay at Goodby. You'll see a lot of copies of this. They're all rechanneled for stereo, mostly. There was a number of recordings on here made in 58 and 9 that were originally made in mono, such as Crying My Heart Out Over You, Big Black Train, Mama and Daddy's Little Girl. And this is one of the last country releases on Harmony. This was released in 68 that also had a mono number to it. And this is the original mono version. And we have Don Gibson. Now, Don Gibson was extremely popular in the late 50s. Very nice recordings of the early Nashville sound. But he also had a career as a hard country singer. He recorded for Columbia, then MGM, earlier for RCA, also with the fiddle and steel guitar sound. And this is some of those Columbia recordings he made around 52 and 53. Then we have Carl Smith, who was a huge artist in the early 50s. Any album, though, you saw of his early songs were generally remakes. But originals were found on Carl Smith's Best, which had the originals of Me and My Broken Heart, Little Girl in My Hometown, Just Wait Till I Get You Alone, Go Boy Go, and that era where he was really big. And then came this one a few years later, Satisfaction Guaranteed. This featured his original of If Teardrops Were Pennies, along with the hit Satisfaction Guaranteed, Trademark, and others. The Stanley Brothers. Some of their best recordings, some of my favorites, were made for Columbia. They first began on Richard Tone in 1947. In 49, they moved over to Columbia. And these harmony albums were the only way for years you could get that era of recordings. Just about everything they did for the Columbia people were released on these albums outside of a couple numbers. So you'll find the old versions of Lonesome River, Lonesome Old River, Fields Have Turned Brown, The Angels Are Singing, Man of Constant Sorrow, and many others. This was a mountain style act, recorded for many years. Some of the better recordings were on Columbia. It took years for Bear Family, County Records, other of those to get to them. But for a long time, the only way you could get them was on this Harmony album. That's where you could get the original Sunny Side of the Mountain. Another country singer had a traditional sound, but he seemed to get more popular in the early 60s, was Carl Butler. This was one album release of some of his early and mid-50s recordings. And then there was Bob Wills. Best recordings were made 1935 to 47 for Columbia. So on Harmony, they released 3 albums of that. Their first Harmony release was his hits of New San Antonio Rose, Take Me Back to Tulsa, Big Beaver, and others. And Harmony, when they first started, almost all their albums were Black Label. This here is the Red Label, which was the first release of this. And then there was also The Great Bob Wills, and then The Best of Bob Wills, containing many of those 30s and 40s recordings. And then Norma Jean. She was popular she was on the Porter Wagoner Show. She was popular in her own right in the 60s on recordings she made for RCA. When she first began recording in 59 and 60, she recorded for Columbia. And this was the only album, and I think the only one to date, that's available of her Columbia recordings. You don't hardly find them anywhere, but this album was a nice album that contained those. Another country singer who was popular in the 60s was Mel Tillis, particularly late 60s and 70s. But his career went back to 57 for Columbia, and some of those recordings from the late 50s and early 60s were available on this album, The Great Mel Tillis Sings. One artist I like a lot, you don't hear hardly anything of anymore, was Molly O'Day. She was a mountain-style country singer in the late 40s, and she had that mountain sound with the dobro and fiddle. Her band was the Cumberland Mountain Folks. Recorded largely gospel, about half of her numbers were gospel. She had a brief recording career for Columbia. This album centered mostly on non-gospel sides, The Unforgettable, Molly O'Day, and the Cumberland Mountain Folks. And this is a gem of an album. Now, Bear Family has, some years ago, they released a double CD set of all of her Columbia recordings. But again, for years, this was the only way to get them. And then finally, Roy Acuff. Now, this was an album that featured 41 recordings, the great Roy Acuff. And then finally, the last one I'll show you. This album doesn't look like much, The Great Speckled Bird. But again, a gem of an album. It had the originals of Wreck on the Highway, Fireball Mail, Precious Jewel, his popular version of Wabash Cannonball, Low and Lonely, hits that really defined him, his sound, his style, and so you'll find it on this album here. So that's just a few I wanted to share with you. Sometime we'll talk about RCA's Camden label releases, King's Audio Lab releases, but just all good stuff within the classic country mold. So this is Vinyl Rob. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. And my Carter family outside of my record's about ready to run out. So I will have to see you next time. Bye now.